So, as I was saying, welcome to Climate Forum, a joint exercise between United Nations Association in Harrogate and Zero Carbon Harrogate. Give a wave, Jemima. So there we go. We've been doing Zoom, Microsoft Teams, online meetings most of the way through lockdown. We've covered some fascinating subjects like building the green economy and transport and energy in buildings and properties and all sorts of things. And it's a great pleasure today to be talking about the impact of data and why data is so important when it comes to sustainability in general, but in particular in climate change. It's great to see Mike Kay on the call today, because he's a man that uses data immensely when it comes to monitoring energy use and carbon dioxide emissions in order to manage climate change. But to be honest, it works in so many different ways. And our two speakers tonight, Phil and Marios. Marios will be going first, but we'll talk to you about a couple of applications about data that you may find surprising if you've not come across them before. So I really hope you enjoy the presentations, and we'll join, and hopefully we'll have some time for conversation at the end and some questions. But do feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and I'll have a look at them from time to time when I'm not otherwise engaged, and we'll make sure that we get round as many of those as we can. So Marius and Phil have become good friends as well, so it's a delight to have them on the show tonight. And without any further ado, I'd like to go to Jemima Parker. Everybody knows, I think, that's on the call, that she is the chair of Zero Carbon Harrogate. And Jemima always gives us some words of wisdom before we go to our speakers. So over to you, Jemima. You may need to unmute. Sorry, I muted everybody. There you go.
There we go. Lovely. Thank you, Clive. I'm not sure about words of wisdom, but I'm aware that climate change is such a big issue. It can feel quite sort of existential, and it can be hard for us to kind of get our teeth into what we can actually do about it. It can feel a little bit overwhelming, and I think that's where kind of we feel with Zero Carbon Harrogate we can come in and bring it down to a local scale. And it's key that we get to grips with the numbers in thinking about how we can bring about change. And so I'm really looking forward to this evening in terms of drilling down into data, because unless we're measuring what we're doing, it's really difficult to assess whether we're affecting change and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. I think perhaps with the COVID pandemic, we've all got a little bit more used to assessing risk and looking at numbers. I don't know about you, but I'm a real fan of the Radio 4 programme More or Less, and they love their numbers, and it's actually been a real aid to me in understanding our level of risk with COVID. And I'm kind of thinking that this evening may be a little bit like More or Less, but for climate and greenhouse gas emissions, particularly for businesses. And I think it's hard to underplay the significance of our businesses in our battle against climate change. So much of the attention is focused and polarized between government action and personal behavioural change, but actually our businesses are determining so much of our world and our culture, and have such an important stakeholder in our fight against climate change. If our organisations change the way that they are behaving and actually are becoming net zero organisations, it will make such a significant difference to all our lives. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Marios and Phil can tell us this evening, and I will hand back to Clive.
Thank you, Jemima. And before Marios begins to give his presentation, I just wanted to say that I came across Marios just after lockdown, when he was giving a presentation on a webinar that Phil was also on, and talking about how Google search information had shifted since the COVID pandemic. You know, instead of people searching for one thing, they started searching for health and COVID, and so people's attention was very much on that. And I know that you're going to give us a slightly different window on data as well tonight then, Marios. So without any further ado, let me hand over to you, unmute yourself, and we'll look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you, Clive. And thanks, Jemima, as well. Can you hear me okay? Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. And so hopefully at this moment, you can see the screen which says why data matters in the fight against climate change. I'll just give a very brief word about us as AxiaOrigin before moving on to what we hope will be a very insightful case study that's very relevant for everybody on this call, because it looks very specifically at Harrogate. But about who we are, just very quickly, as AxiaOrigin, we're a values-driven data analytics consultancy. We're relatively new. We actually just celebrated our 1-year anniversary earlier this month. And we're an organization of 7 people at the moment with big aspirations, actually. But we're devoted to supporting the UN SDGs. And we do so by helping organizations and businesses to make sense of the data that they have and make sense of the business problems that they have by being data driven and delivering really important insights for them. So we operate with a variety of data types, one of which is social media data, which will be the focus of this case study that I'll take you through. Now, I'm going to introduce, just before we get into the question really of why data, how can data help us in the fight against climate change, I'm just going to introduce a concept. This concept that I'm going to talk you through now is the concept of social selling. Typically, it's used to understand the customer journey from brand awareness to brand advocacy. But what we've done is we've taken it a step beyond to apply it to community activism for carbon zero related topics in and around Harrogate. So we've used social media data to really understand where people are in Harrogate along this advocacy journey, which starts from awareness. It starts with people becoming aware of a topical cause, and it goes all the way through to advocacy and role modeling, people aligning themselves to a cause and defining their identity through it, much like this organization, much like Zero Carbon Harrogate. And the reason this is important is actually because one of the set of tools, one of the levers that governments and local authorities have at their disposal is really in convening communities and enabling community-led action against climate change. One of the ways that you do that is through developing a sustainability strategy, for instance. And any local authority organization that is doing that has to be in touch with their people, has to be in touch with their communities. So social media data and insights can really inform us greatly of some really critical insights about how you lead role models to help inspire people in the community and how you enable local hubs to be developing interest around these topics, how you can identify regional advocacy networks. So we'll move on to the next slide. Now, I'm kind of excited to show you the actual analysis. What we did is basically we established a very deep search using social media tools that we have access to, which can look at online forums, online social media platforms such as Twitter and Reddit and other forums. And what we did is we analyzed the totality of the conversation that took place all over the summer in the 4 months leading up to September in and around Harrogate. So we created a very specific search of all of the conversation that was taking place around carbon zero related topics. There were around 17,000 Twitter data points in total. And what we created was a list of 600 role models and advocates that broke down into these types that you see before you. So you see different kind of villages of interest around recreation. There were organizations, individuals in sport, in arts, retail and tourism. We saw groups around agriculture and conservation who were interested in biodiversity, agriculture, ecology. We saw a lot of academics, both in research and doctorate, PhD research, as well as primary and secondary school educators. We also see people around sustainable living, specifically looking at sustainable communities and housing, local politics, recycling, transport. And then we have groups of professionals as well, scientists, people who are focused very specifically on energy-related topics, engineering and professional services. That was the totality of how we grouped all of these individuals. So you can hopefully it's coming to mind how an organization such as a local authority might be able to use these networks to fulfill and share a news story or in gathering kind of interest around a topic, or gathering and convening interest and engagement around a topic. And that's how you can develop advocacy within networks. So what does this ecosystem actually look like? When we look at the people and the organizations, as I said, there are around 600 in total that we looked at. I think it's actually closer to 540, the totality of the advocates and role models that we observed within Harrogate and the surrounding areas. So here you see a few, just to make this come to life really, of what we mean when we say recreation. There are actors and people in theatre. There are sports. There's that intersection between sports and climate, which is actually quite interesting and not something that I would have picked up intuitively. But you do start to see these organizations that are based in Yorkshire, based in places like Harrogate, Otley and the surrounding area, and York, of course, as well. Within agriculture and conservation, we did see a lot of agricultural societies and wildlife societies, raising awareness, raising interest, convening people and convening local individuals to generate interest and make sustainable change a reality. Again, within academia, you can see there was a huge amount of academic advocacy around York specifically. So we did pick up a lot of York-based academics and academic institutions. And you can start to see as well for the remaining interest villages, some of those individuals and groups. And in total, I said earlier that there were around 539 advocates. This is how they broke down. So we have this list. It's something that we curated. It's something that we developed by analyzing the Twitter data. There were around 30% of them that are individuals. And of course, individual groups are those with a generic interest in carbon zero. They're people who state a specific interest among their interests online and on their Twitter biographies, for example. But they're people who don't align necessarily to one of these groups. Whereas, for example, agriculture, it's easy to see when someone says they're a farmer or when somebody says they're part of the biodiversity group of a certain town within Yorkshire. We did see a large number, 21%, that were from agriculture and the conservationist area. That breaks down into agriculture and biodiversity. The next biggest group was those interested in sustainable living. So again, communities and housing, local politics, recycling and transport. Academia, as I said, was quite significant, as were professionals. The recreation group was the smallest in total. We found 14 individuals and organizations that were part of that group. As we move on to the next slide, we'll start to see what some of the regional patterns look like. So you'll see, we'll show you visually this map of the Yorkshire area that we analyzed, and we can start to see some regional patterns of where advocates are driving the conversations around carbon zero in certain hubs within Yorkshire. So on this graph, it allows us really to understand where people are in that journey that we showed earlier, from awareness through to advocacy and role modeling. And linked to that are some specific actions that can be identified to move participants along that journey. So we can see here, and we've ranked these towns and cities in terms of their proportion of conversation that was driven by advocates, to see where it was being dominated by advocates. And the other thing to note actually is that you can probably see in lighter kind of faded blue, there are other cities and towns that we analyzed as part of this search, looking at Harrogate and also the wider area, that came up, but that are not emphasized because they were lower in volume. Size represents volume, so York was a huge hub of conversation in general. Harrogate was also very large, the second largest. But we can see Beverley, Knaresborough, Ilkley, Huddersfield, these had the highest proportion of conversations driven by advocates. The actions that a local authority or a government would take for a sustainability strategy or in convening interest would be different based on whether there were a large number of advocates or a small number of advocates. It's not to say that places like Leeds and Sheffield and Ripon fared poorly in this at all, just because they had fewer advocates. If anything, it shows that there is an opportunity in those places to generate further interest. So where we see Beverley, Knaresborough and Ilkley, where we see high numbers of role models, there's an opportunity here to provide a platform for collaboration across the county by helping convert advocates to role models, using these key areas as kind of hubs for action and hubs for convening individuals through the advocates that are very present and active in those communities. In areas where the focus is more towards awareness, like I said, places like Sheffield, Leeds and Ripon, here there's a really strong potential to actually generate targeted engagement to create more advocates, to help people along that journey. So in those areas, there's more of a burden on local authorities to generate that momentum to convene individuals. And the other places such as Harrogate, York, here they're somewhere in the middle. There's both strong potential because there do exist advocates that are creating that journey, but there's also some effort needed to create targeted engagement there. Another thing we looked at actually was to see where is there the most authentic engagement on this topic. So it's the same map, but a slightly different edge to the analysis. What we mean by authentic engagement is, where was their original thought being added into the discussion? Where were people weighing in with their opinions and not just regurgitating other people's views, not just retweeting information, rehashing it? And here, actually, we saw some really interesting insights because it was the inverse of what we saw previously. So areas where there was low advocacy, such as Wetherby and Leeds, is where we actually saw the most authentic, highest quality engagement. Slightly lower down, places like Huddersfield, Ilkley, Beverley, this is where we saw the highest weighing in of advocates into the conversation, but there is less authentic engagement. So this is another data point that can be used in the strategic communications playbook of people like local authorities, of local organizations, to understand what are the dynamics of how conversations take shape. Where are you more likely to have individuals weighing into a discussion if you want to seek their opinion? Now, we can also see some more of the hyper-local trends here. And we talked earlier about how there were these different personas and groups, such as professionals, academics, sustainable living individuals, agriculture. We can start to see now where there are some very hyperlocal regional hubs that are dominated or have a higher propensity towards some of those personas than others. So what we found were a few of these key insights that you see on the screen here. We saw that Leeds and York.
Hey, Marius, I'm sorry, can I interrupt your flow? There's an interesting question from install
Yes.
account guest, which is what's the demography on Twitter? And I thought, given the momentum in the discussion, it'd be a good chance to address that in case other colleagues are also thinking about it.
Yeah, no, it is a very good question. We do see, well, from this analysis, we've seen, and because the demographics are something that we pick up through the analysis, we've seen quite a range of demographic types, a wide range of age ranges actually present in this conversation. Typically, when we do these kinds of analyses, typically it does cater towards the younger voice. So normally, the people that are most active in contributing on Twitter in particular are people who are either from the millennial age bracket or slightly younger. In particular, in this analysis that we did, however, we saw a really wide range, including quite significantly people who were older and more experienced and more mature. So we did see actually quite a range of people, especially in the agriculture and conservation group, from agricultural backgrounds that were very strongly represented in the data, who were from an older demographic. And that is something which I found to be very interesting. In other instances when we've done this, we've seen much more of a case of there being Extinction Rebellion and very young student age individuals who are convening around these topics, around Extinction Rebellion. We didn't see that as much here, which is also of note as well. It could be because Extinction Rebellion doesn't have a chapter in the Harrogate area, whereas if we maybe looked at some of the larger cities, we could have seen that as well. But no, it's a very good question, and it's something that surprised me from the analysis, that we did see a broad range of demographic types in the data. Just to return to what we have on the screen as well, we saw that Leeds and York were hubs of professional advocates. They had a higher proportion, around 20 and 25% of their advocates were from this background, which was over twice the amount compared to the rest of Yorkshire of what you'd see. That's to be expected. Leeds and York are, of course, quite, I'm sorry, I wasn't meant to do that, are of course, hubs of cosmopolitan. They have a range of services and a range of businesses that are present there. Academics, as I mentioned earlier, York stood alone as a hub for academic advocacy. It had a huge proportion of its advocates from this background, almost 30%, which is around 3 times as much as what you'd see for the rest of Yorkshire. Sustainable living, the advocates were more dispersed, but found particularly strongly in Harrogate and surrounding towns nearby, but also in Huddersfield. And we did see around a quarter to a third of the advocates present in Harrogate and those surrounding areas from that sustainable living group, which are to do with communities, housing, local politics, and transport, electric vehicles, for example. And finally, agriculture and conservation. Harrogate stood out really as a hub for agriculture and conservation, biodiversity and ecology advocacy. So the importance here of why we're showing this, it's not just to make a good story. It's not just to piece together what's going on in the data. It's really to confirm and to reiterate that there are specifically identifiable and detectable hubs for activity and interest that local government, that businesses could identify, and those of, for example, within NGOs such as local United Nations SDG chapters, they could identify these specific hubs to help them facilitate greater convention of people, greater convention of advocacy, and helping to develop better awareness and advocacy around these topics. I'm almost. I thank you for your interest and patience in this. We're about to finish, and I'm keen not to go too much over time, but I'd just like to again reiterate that the steps that we took and why this is important, I think, is actually because as an organization, we're really keen not to dive into the data, and we're actually really keen to start with a outcome that we're looking for, to start with a question that we want to answer and to work from there rather than drowning in data, which is actually one of the pitfalls that you can have by jumping to data. And I think it's especially important for this webinar because the title is all about data, really. But how this could help in the fight against climate change. We started by looking at the actions that could be taken by an organization, by local government. We can look at the positive and negative examples of the signals of what's being recommended by different entities towards carbon zero action. And to answer the question of how are businesses and individuals organizing into communities to fight climate change, we can observe signals of how these businesses, NGOs, and individuals are organizing. We can look at the effects of those behaviors and the interconnectedness, the networks that are present there. That's formed as part of our analysis. The target here is to ensure that people in the Harrogate community are aware of best practices and are able to collaborate with each other, to understand from each other, to understand from the role models of such mobilization against climate change, and to increase mutual support. And the outcome of this goes back to how local governments can help to develop sustainability strategies, to be in touch with their people and with their communities. And data plays a huge role in that. Of course, social media data, it's something which is maybe not intuitive to people, but every time that an individual or an organization communicates online, it's something that can be observed, it's something that can be analyzed, and it's something that can be used for good purposes to help in the fight against climate change. So thank you very much for listening. You can find more of our insights on our website, and you can follow us on social media. We also podcast, so you can listen to what we have to say if today has interested you. But I thank you for listening, and I hope that's been of interest and maybe something a bit counterintuitive, perhaps.
Thank you so much, Marius. If anybody has got any questions, please do post them in the chat, because we will get Phil and Marius back after Phil's presentation to pick up on any questions that have arisen. Before I hand over to Phil, one question that crops up time and time again, Marius, is that we always seem to be, and I hope I'm speaking for Jemima as well, but I'll let her speak for herself in a moment. We always seem to be contacting the converted when it comes to climate change. You know, the people that show up on this forum, at the UNA meetings and the Zero Carbon Harrogate meetings are often people that really feel passionate about wanting to make a difference. From the work that you do, what advice would you give to help us reach the people that we need to reach who are yet to be converted?
Yeah, it's a great question, Clive, and yeah, it's a challenging one, because this is all about hearts and minds, and topics such as climate change, they are, and other activism related topics that affect huge populations, that affect huge demographics of people, they should be things that are universal, but we do find that they can be quite polarized online, and they can be quite polarized within different communities. I think one of the things of note from the analysis that I just shared, and it's one of the reasons why I emphasize the point, is actually to share that it's not necessarily just where there is really strong advocacy that we need to focus, but the areas in the geographical regions where there is lower advocacy, where we saw, for example, Sheffield and Leeds and other areas, they present a real opportunity for people to create targeted engagement for those areas. I would say one of the things that needs to happen is that people need to become wise to the behavioral ways that people consume information and the way that people start that very journey that we talked about, that journey towards advocacy. It starts with awareness. So there is a job to do all across the world, not just in Harrogate, to help people start that journey. So although we focus today on the journey from awareness to advocacy, it starts with awareness, and there are challenging ways that we need to develop and we need to be innovative about how we actually make that awareness more accessible to people, and do so in a way which kind of infiltrates the way that they might think about a topic in a positive way. So yeah, you know, it's very challenging, but I think there are ways that people need to, that governments, that organizations, and that businesses need to make the topic of climate change more attractive to become aware about in the first place.
Thank you so much. Jemima, did you want to comment before I hand over to Phil?
Thank you, Clive, and thank you, Marios. That's absolutely fascinating. I have a geography background, so I love having the maps. It's really helpful, and really interested to see how you had picked up on the different levels of engagement, the advocacy and the more authentic engagement. And you know, I mean, I would be really interested to drill down into that, because one of the things that we particularly do with Zero Carbon Harrogate is that we try to have very constructive engagement. So I'm guessing we probably wouldn't show up on your authentic engagement map, but because we would be trying not to be aggressive in our comments, but you may put me straight on that. I'm interested. The comment about the demographic is interesting as well, I'm also fascinated that we have such a strong agriculture and conservation focus here, which, given that we're surrounded by a very large rural area, doesn't surprise me. But yeah, no, thank you very much.
And there is one question, Marius. I suspect it might be from Mike K. It says install account, and the question was, how long did it take you to get and analyze the data we've just seen? Was that one of yours, Mike? Just nod. Yeah, I thought it might have been. Marius, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Oh, thank you, Mike. It's a very good question. And actually, it's something I should have said up front. This analysis took us probably a good less than a week. I'd say four or 5 days worth of work to do that. I think that is of note because it shows you the potential of readily accessible data that you can access and you can analyze. We analyzed it actually through machine learning principles as well, so that we could analyze the 16 or 17,000 tweets that we got by training an algorithm and running it through that algorithm. So what you've just seen took a few days to do with a greater focus and with greater intention. If you had weeks to do that kind of analysis, you could show up a lot more. And it's something that has a lot of potential, because working with data as we do as an organization, we're constantly running into problems around data access and data transformation, whereas this actually presents a very doable way to access the data. But of course, you have to have a relevant question at hand to begin with.
And dare I ask, Marius, for a very quick answer to Ed. So Ed has asked, and then we're going to move on to Phil and come back to any other questions at the end. But Ed has asked, this is easily measured. Oh no, Shai has already answered Ed's question. So I'll tell you what, we'll leave Ed to read that. He's putting his thumb up, that's great. Let's go to Phil, because Phil will talk about a different sort of data. I'll say no more, I'd rather it came from Phil. So Phil Clothier, would you like to share your screen and introduce, and over to you. Thanks again, Marius.
Hello, just checking everybody can hear me. Thumbs up. Yep, you've got that, good. So my name is Phil Clothier. I live in Rossendale in Lancashire, and just across the border from you in Yorkshire. And I work for Barrett Value Centre, and we measure values, culture, and consciousness of any human group. So that can be anything from one person up to a team, to a whole organization, a multinational corporation, even nations. And we can use the same instrument for doing that. And that's what you'll be seeing. And talking about data, I remember a few years ago, we did a values assessment of an organization. We had 230,000 responses from their employees in 150 countries. And on one piece of paper, the data that I could see on one piece of paper, it gave me a huge insight into the fears, the loves, the concerns, the desires, the heart and soul of a whole organization. And it's that we're able to see about what's working well and what's getting in the way. And what I want to share with you this evening is some views on, let me put my screen up so that we can see. And I'm going to put this in present mode. So is that on now? Good. Okay, so I'm looking at culture data and the impact of climate change. And another way to put that is war and peace. And you'll see why I say that in a moment. But for everybody right now, and mostly for me, I just want you to do this. Okay, so let's just move in now. And I want to start with this quote that we found about a year ago, which completely describes for me the data that we're seeing and how that data works for this. And this is an environmental scientist in the States, Gus Speth. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And that's really the start point of what I want to talk about, is that absolutely true that we need good science, we need good shift of agriculture and technology and all those things, but the inner job is the part where it starts from. And actually, as part of working with us, we've been connecting our work to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and also through the United Nations Culture of Peace work. We've looked at this. A culture of peace is one in which all people belonging to a group are able to get their needs met. And just to connect the dots here, I would say that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are the ultimate statement of human needs at this moment in history. And what we're able to look at is values data that enables us to understand the needs of groups. But I want to go really big picture for the moment and look here at I like to look at extremes to see how this works out. And we'll see these two leaders here. And what we measure is values data. And so here is values data about Gandhi and Hitler. So we know that Gandhi stood for peace and unity and compassion. He had a special word he used called satyagraha, which meant truth force. He believed that it was through the real understanding of truth, the ultimate understanding of truth, that you would create a force for good. And that's what he meant by satyagraha. And Hitler, of course, had different values, ones which were more about domination, separation, cruelty, and power. Hitler had an incredibly dysfunctional childhood, and it's probably due to that he became the person that he became. But if we were to put these two groups of values into different sections, I would say that Gandhi ultimately stood for the values of love, and Hitler is an amazing example of the values of fear showing up across society. And the impact that the more that somebody comes from a space of fear and separation and power and cruelty, and the more senior they become, the more damage they can do in society. And in fact, I looked this morning, I was interested to see, what were the numbers around the environmental impact of war? And we can see that the Pentagon and all of the Pentagon, they actually have 560,000 buildings that are controlled by the US military. So just heating and lighting all of those, and all the effort that goes into high energy war machines, creates something around 70 to 80% of all the energy consumed by the federal government of the USA. And I found this amazing article of the environmental impact of war, especially World War II, on Wikipedia. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper to say, well, how do we get to a point where our internal process creates these sort of climate outcomes? I want to start with this story here. This is a community. Marios was talking a lot about community, communities, insights, leaders, and people being in touch with each other and talking to each other about what's important. And we were asked to measure the values of the people, the culture of a community called Napronym, and the desired culture of the people, what the people wanted. And that's the picture you can see on the right-hand side there. This is very typical of the type of measurements we do. And this was a community that was in deep crisis. They had high levels of alcoholism, drug addiction, levels of crime and family violence that were going on that were completely breaking the community. And of course, there was a strong environmental impact on that as well. And what we've been able to do over the course of 3 years working with these people is not to fix them or tell them what to do, but to facilitate them in understanding who they are, their personal values, what's holding them back, but mostly looking at their desired values and what they want for the future and facilitating them in building that for themselves. And we saw remarkable shifts in employment, in reduction in children attending the safe house, all these areas of positive impact against the SDGs. And we know it was having a positive impact from a climate perspective as well. Just one more quick story, because not only can we measure organizations and communities, we could also done values assessments of whole nations as well. This was a values assessment of Latvia in 2007, where the citizens were saying what we experience now is corruption and bureaucracy and inequality and poverty and unemployment and crime and violence and environmental pollution. And the government took this really seriously. They listened to the people, and over the course of 18 months, through community dialogues in cities and towns and villages, they created the Sustainable Development Strategy of Latvia, which then became the planning document for every aspect of planning, transportation, education, finance. And it was the first time in modern European history that a government had used the values of the people, the data that came from those values, in order to create a sustainable development strategy for the nation. So let's look at this from an organizational aspect so you can see a little bit more about how this data is collected. We asked 3 questions. Select the values that most reflect who you are. We want to know who the people are. Select the values that reflect how the organization currently operates, and select the values you would desire for your organization to achieve its highest potential. Now here, I'm just showing you data from those 2, the middle question, so about the current culture. Organization A, the employees said, our organization stands for client satisfaction, making a difference, integrity, teamwork, humor, fun, quality, ethics, and financial stability. And all I need to tell you at the moment is that each word gets a dot on the chart. So financial stability is a level 1 value. It's that dot at level 1 around viability. And client satisfaction is a level 2 value around relationships. And what we see is a model here that looks at stages of consciousness of both individuals and organizations. And this organization is operating across all these 7 levels. And it's really as we get to levels 5, 6, and 7, where they're about how they make a difference and contribute to society. As organizations get to that level of consciousness, what they're starting to experience is where any harm I do to you, if I put poison on my garden, I'm poisoning myself. If I poison the rivers through my pollution, I'm poisoning myself. And you get to that level of consciousness where you start to see those sort of actions just stop happening. People stop doing that sort of thing when they get to that level of consciousness, because they know if I harm you, I'm harming myself, because actually ultimately we're all one. In this other organization on the right, we see these limiting values here. So the employees are saying the number one thing we see here is blame, and then short-term focus and internal competition and buck passing. And all these red dots here are about the limiting things, the things that are getting in the way. 2 white dots in a current culture is enough to show us that it will be harming the ability to have engaged customers and happy employees. And at 57% cultural entropy, 57% of all the energy going to that system is going into non-productive or destructive stuff. And we see the correlation here between the inner being of the organization and its impact on society, because this stuff creeps out, and they will be doing harm to themselves and harm to society. There's no doubt about that. The key number we see here is that when cultural entropy goes above 40%, we see higher numbers of people with both mental and physical sickness, and that in itself starts to have an impact on society. So Richard Barrett said, organizations are a wholly owned subsidiary of society, and society is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. If society or the environment crash, then business will crash. Caring for the needs of all stakeholders, especially environment, is not a nice philanthropic idea. It is a strategic business imperative. And so this gets back to what I was saying before, that if we harm anything out there, we're harming ourselves, and we're not going to create a sustainable environment. So let's dig one level beneath that, again, to look at the data that we're able to collect, and a really interesting correlation we see here. So not only do we measure organizational data, we can measure data that comes from feedback on leaders. On the left-hand side, you'll see the feedback, that the 360-degree feedback that was given to a leader from 14 assessors. They said, we see you standing for power and blame and demanding and manipulation and controlling and arrogant, and you can see the words there. And on the right-hand side, we were also able to measure the culture of the organization at the same time. And you can see that although the words are a little bit different, the energy of the organization is almost exactly the same. There's a high degree of dysfunctionality. And one important thing to say is that this leader was not a bad person. This is someone that really wanted to do a good job, really cared for his people, and really wanted to create a high-performing organization, but had had a very tough childhood. And this is a pattern we see all over the place, that when people have had a tough childhood and they're holding these fears inside that are still stopping them from truly expressing who they are, then that has an impact on everything they do, and particularly on the organizations they lead as well. And so those inner fears, as we saw with Hitler and Gandhi, those either the fears or the loves, the more senior you become, the more impact you have on the organization, and then the impact that organization will have on society. So here's the pattern we see. The foundation of organizational sustainability is personal sustainability. And let me say that in doing this work, I understand these dynamics. I'm still part of this. I still have bad days. I still have tough stuff that goes on, where I think that my behavior, actually, last week I had to apologize to my team because there was some stuff where, it didn't go very well. And so I'm not an expert telling you how to do this. I'm saying that we're all subject to these forces. So the foundation of organizational sustainability is personal sustainability. How do I manage what's going on inside of myself? And when I, as a leader, can do that then I'll create more sustainable organizations. And when we create more sustainable organizations, we have the possibility to contribute to a more sustainable planet. One of the things we've done recently, this is kind of one of the final pieces on data, is we have been able to map the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly these 5 areas: people, prosperity, planet, peace, and partnership, which are the 5 Ps published by the United Nations. So we can now map our culture data to these 5 Ps. This is the real result for an international organization, for just the leaders at this stage. And there are just 2 bits I want to draw your attention to in here. So when the leaders of this organization got these results, and they saw particularly under peace, and they said, my goodness, we've got hierarchy, empire building, power, blame, and manipulation. How are we ever going to be a force for peace, a force for good in the world, if this is what we're experiencing internally? And externally, with regard to partnership, this is an organization that have been working really hard for the last 5 years on creating good external partnerships, and was struggling to do that, because they knew that it was through partnerships they were going to be able to amplify their ability to have a positive impact on climate and the environment and the world. And they said, if internally we're experiencing internal competition, control, silent mentality, information hoarding, and confusion, how the hell are we ever going to create those positive relationships that we want externally? And so this is the way that we're able to use data to help organizations, and particularly leaders, understand the cultural dynamics that lead to them being able to understand themselves and start to make new decisions. Now, I believe that where we're going is that through this sort of data, and as we get to a shift of consciousness, that we'll be able to shift the fundamental businesses, or the fundamental principles of business, to these sustainability ideas of do no harm, alleviate suffering, and facilitate healing and thriving. And I hope that in 10 years' time, this will be the kind of the reason for every business that underpins all the other things they do as well. Finally, I want to end where I started out. And some of you might have seen the wonderful Gandhi film, the Ben Kingsley Gandhi film. And there's a scene at the end where just before Gandhi gets shot in the garden, and he's talking to a reporter. And Gandhi says, the only devils in the world are those running around in our hearts. And that is where all our battles ought to be fought. And the reporter, Margaret Bork-White, said, so what kind of warrior have you been in that warfare? And Gandhi says, not a very good one, but it helps me understand all the other scoundrels of the world. And for me, that's a nice place to finish, because what this talks to is that even though we are all struggling with our own inner stuff. Clive and I were having a little chat about that earlier on the idea of forgiveness. An article he's just written on forgiveness. And even though we're struggling with our own stuff, if I look at Gandhi, who knew he was struggling, can still make a huge difference in the world. Well, that for me is inspiration. And I'll just leave you with one final thought. We have something called the personal values assessment, and I'll give you the link. I'll put it in the box. It's free of charge. We've had over 1.2 million responses to the personal values assessment. This is data too. Shows you that like what's most important to people on the planet right now. So those dots at level 4 are really about a strong sense of relationship. There's people need to be in relationship to each other, and those dots at level 5 are really about a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And so what bonds us together is that sense of meaning and purpose. And you're very welcome to take one of these values assessments for yourself to discover some of that for yourself. Okay, so I'm going to stop my screen and leave it there. Thank you. Clive, I think you're muted now.
I am indeed. Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for sharing that wonderful presentation. I don't know how you managed to convey so much information in such a short time. I've seen 2-hour versions of that, and it holds me absolutely transfixed. So fabulous. And I would echo what you said about the personal values assessment. If people want to understand this system more, then please do go to the Barrett website and take the personal values assessment. It's completely free of charge, and it will give you an idea of how this works. And thinking, Phil, particularly about climate change and climate change in Harrogate, what I've gleaned from your presentation is that Harrogate is far more likely to rise to the challenge of climate change in particular if the values of the people in Harrogate are suitable for doing that. And I wonder, if it were possible, would you advocate, and you wanted to make the biggest difference, would you advocate a town values assessment? In other words, we did a values assessment for everybody in Harrogate. Or would you advocate starting, for example, with the Harrogate Town Council or something like that? Where would you begin to find out where our values are with regards to making the changes that we would like to see happen?
So I'd say that engaging people at some point is really important. And in fact, some of the data we've studied looks at modern Western democracies with high levels of education is a good place to start. So we know that authoritarian regimes, for example, I did a values assessment in Venezuela a few years ago, and I got stopped at the airport by two armed government officials who were very unhappy with me being there. That was a place where the government absolutely did not want to engage. And so what you need is firstly leaders who are willing to engage. So if the town council, if local government is willing to start this work for themselves, then that's a great place, because they then become the models and the advocates of the work, and they have more credibility to engage others. In fact, that happened a few years to us ago with a very large district of South Africa, where the government said, we want to go out and ask the people, who are they, what do they need, what are their values? And just before we started that, they had this big aha, like, well, actually, we have no integrity. We need to do this work for ourselves so we can authentically go out and do it. So I would say that if you've got leaders who are willing to do it, that's a great start. But don't wait too long, because I know that, like, Agenda 2030 is not long away. So start where you want. Actually, neither would be a bad option.
Yeah, and I guess another alternative is to engage any of the businesses, particularly the big businesses that are influential in our area, and encourage them to participate in something like this. Now, Marius has posted a question, but Marius, are you happy to unmute and put your question direct to Phil?
Yeah, I am happy, Clive. Yeah, thanks. And yeah, it was really just to kind of pose to Phil the question that you asked earlier, Clive, which is that how do you reach out to the unconverted? Because when you asked that of me, I actually reflected afterwards that that's something that is very relevant to the Barrett values, culture and values assessments, and the way that that could actually uncover and reveal a lot about unconverted people. So yeah, I would love to know your thoughts, Phil, on how culture and values data can help us to do that, to reach out to people who might not already be on that advocacy journey to climate change.
So I don't have an answer. I don't have a silver bullet for this, but I have some thoughts. So firstly, the type of work we do in organizational transformation and leadership development, people have to choose to do it. You cannot force this work on anybody. And so we will only work with organizations who come to us and say, we need help with this in some way. They're either in crisis or they're visionary and they want to do the work. So that doesn't really answer for the unconverted. And I think for me myself, I've got two ways of looking at this. One is shock and one is inspiration. And in fact, there's something I'm working on right now, and I asked Clive, because I realized the way that I was starting to approach it was, come on, guys, we don't have a choice. that if businesses don't get on board with this, there will be no business, there will be no economy. And I think of my kids are now getting married, and they're probably about to have children. I think, well, how we're going right now, there will be no future for my children's children. And so for me, that's the shock side. I talked to Clive about it, and he wrote a piece that was totally inspiring, and a way that I hadn't seen it before. And so I actually think that both are necessary. I think that there are some hard realities now that are shocking, that are good to put out there, but we have to balance it with the other side of the story, which is to inspire people as well.
Wow. Well, I would like to say to everybody, if you have questions for Marius or for Phil, please do either put them in the chat, or there is a symbol on the screen for the uninitiated with a hand on it. You can click on that and raise your hand. Or for those of you that have got your videos working, you can just stick your hand in the air, and I'll try and get to you. So if anybody's got any questions, please do come forward. I think, yeah, I think we've answered all the questions that are in the chat. While people are thinking about it, Phil, I do have one more question for you, and I'm going to try and ask it in a non-technical way. I have to declare that I'm also a Barrett Values Centre practitioner, so I know the instrument. But one of the things that struck me when you showed us the data of all the personal values assessments was the fact that there is nothing at level 6 and 7 in the aggregate of those scores. In other words, people are thinking very much about relationships, but not necessarily holding dear a concern in the majority about what goes on in terms of making a bigger difference to the planet. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, firstly, you're right. That is an aggregate picture. And within that aggregate picture, there will be, if that's 1.2 million, there will be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who are holding values that exist across the spectrum, particularly at 5, 6, and 7, which is really the space of how we contribute and make a difference to the world. But with all data, I mean, what it comes down to, when you look at an aggregate picture, you're going to see where is the predominance of society at the moment. And I would say that one of the things we know is that that over the last 20 years, 20 years ago, when we were even talking about values, we were seen as weirdos or lefties talking about organizational values. That was not a common part. And organizational responsibility for climate change is still not where it should be. So I know that when the UN launched the SDGs, there was that amazing video. Remind me what it's called. It's called "No Point Going Halfway."
Yeah, with Usain Bolt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the intention was that within 30 days, everybody on planet Earth would know about the SDGs. And I think it got to somewhere about 4 or 5% of people on the planet knowing about the SDGs. And so my point is that it's still not, although it's growing within consciousness, and David Attenborough is doing an amazing job with like extinction and plastic bags and all those sort of things. And so that is coming more into the public consciousness, but it's still not mainstream, I would say, which is why the data probably exists the way it does, that it's an emerging thing for many people, but it's not the majority yet.
I'm going to come to Ed. Just one comment that struck me as you were answering there, Phil, is that if the thing that people care the most about is their families, mm-hmm. I do wonder whether the route to get them interested in climate change is to share messages about future generations. I don't need you to answer that. Let's go to Ed, but maybe ponder on that as we progress. Ed.
Hi. You've sparked so many different things. I'm going to struggle to formulate my question into something that's probably coherent. I'm just really intrigued because I tend to work with SMEs and mid-sized businesses, and I've always been passionate to get them to start looking at their overall responsibility, to their employees, to the environment, to the broader community.
Yep.
And I know I get them to do it. I get them to go so far. They're all bright, intelligent people. They'll do so much, and then the rest is just seen as an option. They don't have to do it. And it's always intrigued me as to they're aware of all companies. They go to this, they listen to case studies and all of that, and yet they still see it as an option. And it's really intriguing the way you just presented the differences there between company A and company B. So I haven't really formed, you know, my challenge there is, you know, how do I get those businesses to go from just there to get them to go there? Because the rest is just purely seen as an option because they make good money. They have good staff retention for now. They've got a 10-year, you know, they've got several years of growth, for example. And they say, well, actually, what we do is a success. Why do we need to do anything more? And there don't seem to be enough examples around for them to say, yeah, okay, great. I know this is the right way of doing it. We've kind of learned about leadership styles and things like that, but we haven't yet learned this. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, Phil, before you answer, can I offer in the thoughts of Mark Carney, the previous governor of the Bank of England, who very recently described those organisations that are out of kilter with the bigger agenda as the sunset sectors. In other words, they'd be the sectors that are dawning. He was even advising banks to stop investing in them. So there's something in there about, as Phil has mentioned, the SDGs are really the only global vision that there is, and certainly the only global vision that has been signed on to by all world leaders. So the question in terms of appealing to business leaders is, to what extent are you aligned with the vision of humanity? Because if you want to be relevant in the years to come, the more you're in line with what the world wants, the better there is, the more chance there will be of business success. Phil, you'll have thoughts, so would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, briefly. I wonder if Shoy has a thought as well, because he's put his hand up. But
well, let's go for Shy then, and come back to you if.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. 2 points. A couple of years ago, in the team Marius and I were in before we founded AxiaOrigin, someone dropped out of a big presentation, and I had a chance to explain our principles to a UN Global Compact global meeting, a bit of a summit, and I explained the calculation of the economic benefit for the SDGs to a bunch of governments and senior business leaders. And it was a really convincing logical argument. It's like a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity for all the sectors for the next 20, 30 years. And no one cared, even though it was, okay, now I should be more precise. My emotional reaction to it is just revealing itself there. The senior leaders involved didn't seem very bothered that it was a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. And I found that curious, because in the firms that have influenced my career development, the size of the prize seemed to always make a bit of a difference. And then there's another example that isn't used very often, which is the way electronic medical records suddenly improved in the United States. After the housing crash, there was an American Recovery Act. I think it was called the Restoration and Recovery Act from the Obama administration. And they incentivized every single GP, what we'd think was a GP practice in America, to adopt an electronic medical record. So for several decades, they'd really struggled to get GPs, the equivalent to GPs, to standardize their data collection. So in a moment of utter economic devastation, they offered every equivalent GP $20,000 to buy an electronic medical record system, which costs a lot less than $20,000. But all you need to do, if you want the money, is tell us which one you bought and give us a simple return so we know how much it cost. And unsurprisingly, nearly every single family doctor in America took the incentive. And so, Phil, I wonder whether not part of the solution is to make it really boring and to make it part of an incentive program where every single business in the country does a values assessment focused on sustainability. Now, of course, there'd be 101 reasons not to do that, because of some argument to do with the level of engagement needed. But it occurs to me that even when you explain the size of the prize, it still doesn't affect these people who you'd think would be quite interested in a $2 or $3 billion improvement in their top line, right? So yeah, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to share those perspectives, and at AxiaOrigin we've become a bit of an advert for Phil. We've become extremely convinced that culture and values applied to advanced analytics is going to be one of the keys that unlocks this problem, because lots of people want to make more money using their data, and if we can actually help people use values to be commercially successful using their data, then there's a little combination of factors there that isn't very mainstream at the moment. So a silver lining as well, perhaps.
Thanks, Shai. And Alex, you've been waiting patiently to ask a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I know we can't see your video, but we can hear you.
Okay, I did put in the messaging box that I'm not Alex Marsh, actually. I'm Arnold Warnickan. I'm using Alex Marsh's iPad. I wanted to just ask both organisations a little bit around the question that was posed earlier about how we get those that are either in denial or really don't appear to care to listen to us. And I'd like to draw an analogy to a seminar I was on yesterday about racism. And in that seminar, we were drawn in to believe that within ourselves, there's an element of us that also isn't quite convinced about climate in this case. There's some doubt in our minds. It might be only 0.5%, but there's something that, because otherwise our lives wouldn't be like we have. Those that think I'm from an agricultural background, I would say that how many people on this seminar buy organic and fair trade? There's an element of us that isn't quite there. But the other side of that seminar yesterday focused a lot on working with people and viewing people as allies rather than as somebody we're going to talk to and try and change. And I wondered how important that the Phil and Marius, the writing's really small, by the way, you're all postage stamp size because I'm on an iPad, how important you felt that was in terms of our approach to try and bring people on board. Thank you.
Just say the question again. How important is?
How important do you feel it is to view people as allies in the programme of making change, or do you think we can do it how a lot of people do it at the moment, through pontificating, talking down, and breaking down negotiations right from the very start, in my opinion? But by being an ally, we have to within ourselves admit that we're not perfect also.
Well, in my view, it's the only way. You've got to create dialogue. Our tools, although they're called measurement tools, are actually not really measurement tools. They're dialogue tools. And when we did a values assessment of 230,000 people, the organisation honestly had a dialogue with 230,000 people in order to find out what they meant by those results. And so for me, it's a non-negotiable. If organizations think that we're going to do a values assessment and the leaders are going to figure out the answer and tell everybody what to do, then we wouldn't even start the work. It has to be the whole system in dialogue with each other. And that's what we saw. I mean, okay, in Latvia, they didn't get every citizen across the country, but they spent 18 months in town halls and villages and cities and inviting people at least to have their voices heard, so there could be an extremely wide participation from across the country. So the politicians and civil servants were very informed around the real stated needs and desires of people, in order so they could then be informed about creating policy. So critical for me.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And Mike Kay, you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something or ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the majority of local authorities, in fact, I think all local authorities have had a sustainability values document now for around 3 to 4 years. And despite having that document, very, very few of them have actually moved anything on in any meaningful way or managed to engage with the population, whether it's in Harrogate or Gloucester or wherever. So I'm intrigued by the conversation, and I'm intrigued specifically around, Marios's model. But despite the fact that we've got these documents that have been there for a long time, and we've got people like David Attenborough, really bringing it home with that program last night about extinction, people still want to seem to talk about things rather than actually getting on with the job. And that's the bit that I just don't understand.
Yeah, one of the things, just a quick comment, sort of linking that to what Arnold was saying. There is a lot of adversary style dialogue that goes on around climate change. People want to criticize, and most of the conversation it's sort of a conflict conversation. And I do believe that one of the ways we're going to bring people on board is by celebrating things that are happening, that are doing well. One of the conversations I've had with Jemima, and I'd welcome her views on this, is that if only we would celebrate every single gain towards, every single step towards zero carbon, and make it as public as we can. So, I'm thinking, Mike, of the work that you've done with lowering the energy consumption of places like the public car parks. Well, who knows when they drive into the car park that amazing work has been done. There is no badge that says this is one step towards zero carbon Harrogate. When we put a cycle lane in, there is no plate on the roadside that says this is one step towards zero carbon Harrogate. And I think when we start celebrating the gains that we are making, and there are many, then people will begin to take interest. And I think we gain more by being positive and celebrating progress than we do by criticizing the opposite. Phil?
Yeah, I want to say that I mean, there's a theme to this, and it really comes down to human psychology. We're all extremely addicted to what we're addicted to, and we don't want to change because that means giving up our addictions. And Al Gore got it right. It's an inconvenient truth right now that things need to change. And we did a values assessment. Actually, Shoy and Marius and the team helped us with that. We did a values assessment of 6 weeks into the COVID crisis of what had happened in organizational culture as a response to COVID, and transformations that typically take 5 to 7 years had happened in 6 weeks, and because people were faced with a crisis and they had no choice. And at the moment, we're not at that point. And actually, we are at that. We on this call all know we're at that point, but most people don't believe that to be true yet, because they can still go about doing what they normally do and in the way that they do it, and there's no hit at the end of the day. Like COVID has been a very sharp shock, but I think that what's coming after, the waves that are going to come after that are going to be much bigger. So I think in my brief answer is there's two things. One is crisis. When a crisis hits either at societal or organizational level, that forces change. The other is inspiration, and inspiration in terms of, wow, look at what we can do with reducing carbon footprint of car parks or whatever it is. And it's the combination of those two that we need to continue to work with.
Hey, Clive. Clive, can you hear me?
Sorry, who's speaking?
Paul Haslam. I'm the one walking in the pathway.
Okay, I didn't see a hand or a video. I can see you now. I take it you'd like to say something, Paul.
Yeah, first, there'll be an email to North Yorkshire tomorrow suggesting that every environmental thing they do, I don't suppose they'll put one on every lamppost across North Yorkshire that's got an LED bulb in it. But certainly I can push very hard that they put signs on things as they do, and I'll do the same at HBC. So I thought that was a very smart idea. So thank you for that one. I'll steal it. If they like it, it's mine. If they don't like it, I heard it from you, Clive. I mean, sorry, the other way round.
That's absolutely fair enough, and I'm sure Mike Kay will give you a list of properties that you can stick some badges on. So thanks for that.
Just before, the other thing is, I think it's Phil. He makes a very good point. The thing is that most of us are away from. We're not towards people. So although we can say this is very good, we actually have to prod people with a sharp stick, i.e. the crisis. And my original question was going to be but Phil's answered in part, is that if we could actually get over climate change like the COVID crisis, then we would get very rapid change. And I've just, funnily enough, I've written it this evening, that the climate change isn't going to be like COVID. There's no vaccine. There's no second chance. People are already dying, and but it's a crisis. It's the boiling frog in the pan crisis, rather than dropping a frog into a boiling pan.
Yeah.
And we've just got to find a way to create a crisis. And unfortunately, although I did enjoy the program that was on TV last night with Attenborough, it wasn't shocking enough, and sadly, I think it's almost got to be, radically shocking, because people, it's how do you move people from 0 to 1 mile an hour? Never mind, and it is a challenge. But I'm very encouraged by what I've heard.
Thanks, Paul.
We're all talking about it.
Thanks, Paul. I am conscious of the time. I always promise to get people away by 7:30 at the very latest. And I do want to give Jemima an opportunity to say something on behalf of Zero Carbon Harrogate. And then I'll do a little bit of summing up. If anybody's got a final brief question, do put it into the chat as Jemima's speaking, and we'll see if we've got time for a quick answer. But Jemima, what do you think?
Thanks, Clive. I think I should firstly just explain that Paul is one of those allies who is both a Harrogate Borough District Councillor and a North Yorkshire County Councillor, and also sits on the Harrogate Climate Change Coalition. And it's good that the council have initiated a climate coalition, because we're talking about allies and working together. I think perhaps we could do with a little more of assessment of what's going on, and how as a district people are engaging. And I think the climate coalition could really benefit from your expertise, Marios, and we could certainly deal with a load more of Phil's assessment of the values that we have across the district and in different organisations. I would concur with what Phil said about COVID and the fact that we had a really with the COVID crisis, we've had really clear science. People have assessed the risk, and then they have taken action, appropriate behavioural change, and that's definitely what we need to do with climate change. I'm very conscious, though, that fear, as Phil picked up on, is not a good motivator, and that actually, from a Zero Carbon Harrogate perspective, we've tried very hard to put across those good case studies like the one that Mike was explaining, and actually motivating people by seeing what can be done, and actually those kind of no-brainer, how much better our society would be if we took the action that we need to become a zero carbon society. And just to pick up on one last thing, we talked a little bit about the impact on our children. Actually, it's the impact on us now. And I think that's a really clear message that we need to get across to people. It's not the next generation. We're seeing this now. So that can-do approach and working with our allies. I'm looking forward to drawing on Phil and Marcus's expertise in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jemima. And if I can just extend and add to your thanks to Marius and Phil. It was great to have you both on this climate forum. That we could have continued the dialogue all night, but we need to let everybody go, sadly. I noticed, Phil, you put a link in there. I think that's the link for the Usain Bolt going the extra, whatever that video is called.
No point going halfway.
No point going halfway. That's the one. I've seen it so many times. And Phil, I know you're nimble with your fingers on things like this. If you've got the link to the video of the COVID analysis, there may be people that are interested in that. If you could bob that into the chat, that would be great. I know there's a report on the Barrett website about that as well, if anybody would like to see it. So thanks, Marius. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Jemima. Thank you all for attending. And we look forward to the next Climate Forum in October. Full details, I think, are already on the Zero Carbon Harrogate website. We're looking at insulation and the importance that plays in climate change. And I'll see you then. So we'll get the recording up on the available on the Zero Carbon Harrogate website and on my YouTube channel so that anybody can see it. Thanks ever so much, everybody. Have a great rest of the evening and see you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank